Hi, today on episode 345 of your favorite daily podcast, a couple of things, a podcast about things. I'm going to be talking about literacies, digital literacies, etc., and how do we define that? And yeah, let's talk about that. So, something I've been thinking about in the past couple of years, especially in the context of UX and technology, is um, inclusion and accessibility from the point of view and perspective of digital literacy. And in school, in one of the courses I'm doing, which is about data studies, we recently talked about data literacy, digital literacy, and that kind of thing. And it made me think some more and have kind of a different perspective on the topic of literacy. So, as you know, I'm in the Netherlands and I'm doing a master's program here. And so, most of the research and things that we're talking about is based on the Dutch system, although it's like a international program or whatever, but there's some of the research that we read about, because it's right, the research that is done in the school is around the Netherlands. And we recently had to read a paper about literacy and how people with low literacy are accessing or using digital services in this instance. Um, and we talked about literacy in class, so like designing for literacy, data literacy, digital literacy, those kinds of things. And I started thinking about the different kinds of literacy that there could be. So usually when we're thinking about literacy, and from my perspective, which is very interesting because I've been talking about inclusion and everything, and even in the context of inclusion, I've talked about localization and language. But I never really considered the perspective of literacy from the point of view of language. So, for example, somebody whose first language is not English or does not speak English at all can be highly literate in their own language but have low literacy in English, which is a thing that you start to really experience and uncover when you are in the context of a language that is not your first language or a language that you speak at all. So in my example personally will be moving to the Netherlands. I have high English literacy, but for the first couple of years here, I did not know anything. Like I had very low Dutch literacy, and I could not interact effectively with digital services and even non-digital services that were offered primarily or solely in Dutch. So in that context, I had low literacy, but in another context, I might have high literacy. And so that was very interesting to me because we were talking about in the class, like, how do you define what literacy is? And obviously, in the context of if you're building a service for, say, for the, if you're the Dutch government or an arm of the government or a governmental service that's building a platform, digital platform, or whatever, primarily you will be focusing on Dutch because that's the language of the country, the lingua franca, whatever. And so somebody who is coming from a background where they don't speak Dutch um will struggle with that system if there are not things that are incorporated to help them to be able to use that system even with low Dutch literacy. So we talked about like, oh, I mean, we have quote unquote the basic levels of literacy, which is like, oh, numbers, numeracy, reading, things like that. But again, it's not the same universally because again, I can read in English, but up until maybe early this year, I mean, I could read what I was reading in Dutch, but I didn't understand it. So, for the most part, so yeah, in that sense, I lack the literacy there, and it got me also thinking because in the conversation in class went to things like, okay, so maybe we can define literacy as in the context of things that make you able to participate in society and have probably social, political, or economic value, right? So in that sense, you would say like, oh, being able to read, being able to, do things like that, but say maybe having some niche knowledge does not count as literacy. And I thought about it and I was like, could you then I feel like you can argue that somebody like something like having knowledge of the Game of Thrones world, for example, there's a Game of Thrones literacy or Harry Potter literacy or Lord of the Rings literacy, because they are actually social and economic groups and value that is associated with those kinds of things. So even though it may not be like at a level as large as, oh, having, I don't know what other example to use, but like, yeah, like literacy on the level of, oh, I have high literacy with like, I know all the lore and things about Harry Potter or Game of Thrones or some other fantasy world, or maybe even Dungeons and Dragons. So these things, there's economic, to some extent, there's social value, and to some extent economic value in that. So it doesn't mean that, does then that mean that everybody now has to know it? No. And another thing we talked about in school was about, like, in my class where we were debating this topic, was about, like, medical literacy, for example. What is a baseline acceptable level of literacy for medical knowledge? Because, for example, I don't and cannot know everything there is to know about the human body and biology. I mean, that's why they're doctors. That's why there's the experts that know these things. Or, for example, with, like, COVID, where people were like, oh, the vaccine is this, the vaccine is that. And people, but, like, I don't know how vaccines are made. Do I need to know how vaccines are made? What level of literacy do I have to have on that topic as an everyday person? Maybe something happens that piques your curiosity about a certain field, but it doesn't then mean that you have, like, a high level of literacy in that topic. It just means that you know something about it. So where is the baseline where you define that, oh, this is and the minimum / acceptable level of literacy on this topic for you to function generally in society? I don't know. Or when you talk about political literacy, so we talk about that as well. Like, what level of knowledge does everyone need to have about something like how the government works in your organization, in your country? How are people elected into the different positions? What are the different levels of the government, and how do they work, and all those kinds of things? Yes, there's a baseline, but what is that baseline? Is it what you learn up to the level of high school, secondary school, or should you know more than that? And how involved should you be? And when I say you, I mean, I'm talking about what is the acceptable level for every person who is a part of society to understand. So, like, okay, you have a washing machine. What, like, how much, like, so it was just a very interesting topic, because I was just thinking about, like, the different ways that you can define literacy, and the level, what is the minimum minimum acceptable level of literacy. Because something that we also talked about was, even in the context of digital literacy, so there was someone in my class who was like, oh, her dad can build computers, like, he can actually create a computer and build it, but he struggles with logging into his Gmail. Like, that is wild, because I don't know how to build a computer, but I don't struggle with those other kinds of things. And, like, it's such a broad sphere that it's difficult to then say that, oh, somebody has low literacy. You have to contextualize that statement. Low literacy in what? Specifically, and how specifically? Because even in the context of people where you say that, oh, people with low literacy levels, they have other ways in which they're able to compensate for that in a certain instance. So, like, think about maybe using a smartphone, for example. You have friends, you have resources and network that can help you with finding the answers. So for me, with Dutch, for example, because of Google Lens and Google Translate, even though at the maybe my first year in the Netherlands, my literacy level with Dutch was low, I was able to gain some kind of competence within the constraint that I had with Google Lens. So yeah, I don't know. There's no really major points that I don't know what the major point is, but I guess the point is that, like, I just found this very interesting, and it has been on my mind for the past week or so. And yeah, the podcast is about what's on my mind. So yeah, that's what's on my mind today. Thank you for listening, you guys. 20 no, not 20. Yeah, 20 days left in the year. No? Yeah? Is it 20 days left in the year? What am I talking about? Yes, I was right. 20 days left in the year. That is so exciting. Oh my goodness. So 20 episodes to go. I'm so thrilled. And we are counting down to the end of this daily podcast. So yeah, thank you for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of A Couple of Things. If there was anything you found interesting or insightful, or you enjoyed the episode, please do share to someone or multiple people. Like, leave a comment, and definitely do subscribe and all the nice things. Bye.